Hello friends, this is Jim with Science Talk. I want to bring you the latest information concerning plastics. I have done stories in the past about plastics in the environment. I've talked about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and other issues involving plastics. For example, organisms washing up dead, and when a necropsy was performed, finding loads and loads of plastic in their esophagus, their stomach, and so forth. So, what I want to discuss with you here is plastic particles. I'll explain what that means in a moment. Plastic particles are now found all over the Arctic. Tiny plastic particles have been found in every sample collected of Arctic sea ice. Let me repeat that again. Tiny plastic particles have been found in every sample collected of Arctic sea ice. The ice can only hold these basically indestructible pollutants for so long. They tend not to break down too readily. Plastic particles have now been found in one of the last previously uninvaded, if you will, areas, basically the Arctic Ocean. German scientists sampled sea ice from 5 locations within the Arctic Circle and counted up to 12,000 microscopic particles per liter of sea ice. Now, a liter is just a little larger than a quart as far as volume. You have 12,000 microscopic particles. They have been able to identify the sources and piece together how the particles moved around. Some tiny lumps of plastic detritus have made their way north from basically the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which covers a huge area. It's about the size larger than France. And in that Great Pacific Garbage Patch, there's an estimated 80,000 tons of plastic floating in the ocean, and that's about 1 trillion pieces of plastic. So if they're able to trace some of the plastics found in the Arctic to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, obviously these particles are traveling on currents thousands of miles. Now, the way the flow, the circulatory patterns of the Arctic is pretty much water from the Pacific will enter the Arctic Ocean via the Bering Strait and through the Chukchi Sea and so on. And there's the Lomonosov Ridge, which is a ridge on the floor of the Arctic Ocean that separates 2 huge basins. So you almost have kind of almost like 2 separate circulatory entities within the Arctic Ocean. But eventually, water will come out on the Atlantic side. You got the Fram Strait, and you've got this, by Greenland, you have the Labrador Current, which is some of the coldest waters on the planet. The Labrador Current is also the current that brought the iceberg that the Titanic kind of met up with. You kind of know what happened to that ship. But in a general way of speaking, water enters through the Bering Strait into the Arctic Ocean and comes out the Atlantic side, basically, with a bunch of swirlies and gyres and all that kind of stuff inside. But that's in a very general way of putting things. That's kind of what happens. So, other fragments that began as paint and nylon basically can be found that got introduced by freight ships, fishing vessels. The scientists report in the journal Nature Communications. So, we have researchers from the Alfred Wegener Institute, the Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research. Okay. During our work, we realized that more than half of the microscopic particles trapped in the ice were less than a 20th of a millimeter wide. which means they could easily be ingested by Arctic microorganisms like ciliates and copepods. Okay, ciliates, if you think back to high school biology, you probably looked at paramecium in one of your little microscopic labs. That's an example of a ciliate. It is a single cell organism. Its a cell membrane is covered by short little cilia. The difference between cilia and flagella is just the length, and the cilia beat and the organism moves through the medium. Well, that's basically what they're talking. And if you remember the paramecium, there was a structure called the oral groove, in which food particles were swept in, formed a food vacuole around it, digestion takes place, and so on. Well, they're now postulating and speculating that ciliates could easily ingest such particles. Now, to put in perspective, a 20th of a millimeter, okay, 10 millimeters equals 1 centimeter. Right? Centimeter is about 2/5 of an inch. Or another way of putting it, 25.4 millimeters is equivalent to 1 inch in length. So you have a 20th of a millimeter. Okay? Now, the researcher who made that statement is Dr. Ilka Pekin, who is a biologist with the Alfred Wegener Institute. No one can say for certain how harmful these tiny plastic particles are for marine life, or ultimately also for human beings. Why I say ultimately for human beings? If you have copepods ingesting the particles, the fish will ingest these particles. Small fish. Small fish are preyed upon by larger fish. And maybe some of those larger fish are commercially important fish, fish that humans consume. I did a video where I discussed bioaccumulation through the trophic levels. That is in essence the principle here. Accumulation of toxic elements as you go up through the trophic levels. Toxic elements tend to get concentrated per gram of body weight as you move from trophic level to trophic level. So yes, we can't say for certain how harmful these plastic particles may be, but I'm willing to hypothesize it won't be good. The researchers gathered their samples during 3 expeditions to the Arctic, aboard the icebreaker Polar Stern in the spring of 2014 and the summer of 2015, following an ice movement called the transpolar drift from Siberia as far as the Fram Strait. This is alluding to what I mentioned earlier about circulatory patterns in the Arctic Ocean. And in the Fram Strait is where we have warm Atlantic water meeting the polar waters as well. The transpolar drift was first identified by the Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen aboard the Fram, hence Fram Strait. And he did his work, he was a pioneering oceanographer, he did his work in the late 19th century. In fact, he even let the Fram get frozen into the sea ice, and that's how he kind of figured out, by seeing where the ship moved around, said, oh, there must be surface currents. He was able to ascertain the movement of surface currents. Okay, microscopic particles are defined as 5 millimeters or smaller. Many are measured in millions of a meter. Millions of a meter equates to micrometer. So 1,000 micrometers equals 1 millimeter. So basically, if you were to then say, okay, if 10 millimeters equals 1 centimeter, then 10 times 1,000, that means there are 10,000 micrometers in 1 centimeter. And there are 100 centimeters in a meter, so 100 times 10,000 gives me what? 1 million. So there are 1 million micrometers in a meter. This is why the metric system is so easy. Everything's powers of 10. So what is the magnitude? Just move the zeros around. Real easy to convert. So, microscopic particles defined as 5 millimeters or smaller. They are formed by the deterioration of large pieces of plastic that is dumped into landfills, which is done so in billions of tons, or released into waterways and thus into the ocean. Man-made synthetic polymers basically are indestructible. And this is now a major source of marine pollution and a constant hazard to wildlife. I alluded to earlier about organisms being washing up dead and finding plastic, ropes, fishing lines, and all sorts of things in their guts. This is a major problem. More than 2/3 of the particles measured 50 millionths of a meter or smaller. Some were as small as 11 micrometers. The researchers identified 17 different types of plastics in the sea ice. And this team was led by Dr. Gunnar Gerst. His laboratory did a lot of the measurements, a lot of the identification of the materials. Paints, nylon, polyester, cellulose acetate, used in cigarette filters, packaging materials, polyethylene, polypropylene, degraded fishing equipment. This is just a sampling of what they're finding out there. The guess is that the plastics endure in the sea ice for between 2 and 11 years before melting from that icy packaging in the Fram Strait to begin sinking in deeper waters. One study recently found 6,500 bits of microplastic per kilogram sampled from the sea floor. So it's all the way down. This is an important finding because it means they were always present in the water under the ice as it was growing and drifting within the Arctic Ocean. This is a statement from Jeremy Wilkinson, who's a sea ice physicist with the British Antarctic Survey. He went on to say this is a benchmark study. Sea ice grows from the freezing of seawater directly onto the bottom of the ice. That means it grows vertically downwards. So as it does so, it will incorporate these microscopic particles of plastic. What does this mean? What's the implication? Microplastics are probably far more ubiquitous within not just the surface waters, but all the way down to the seafloor, at least in the Arctic. Nowhere is immune from plastics in the water. Nowhere. This is a, you don't hear this story talked about much, but this is a major environmental issue. And we need to change the materials that we use in doing a lot of the things that we do. Anyway, as I said before in the earlier videos I discussed plastic, this is a story I'm going to be tracking, and from time to time I'll bring you updates such as this one here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your time. We'll talk again. Hey folks, just a reminder to please subscribe and hit the bell so you know when I drop a video, and please share my work with others. I also hope you will support my work by becoming a patron at Patreon. Details in the description box below.